Hi everyone, welcome to episode 4 of the Bharatvaarta podcast. So this is a commentary on politics, policy and culture focused on India, and we have a very special midweek podcast with Harsh Gupta, who is a public markets investor and a pretty outspoken voice on policy and politics on Twitter. We have Rajiv Mantri as well, who's a venture capitalist, runs Navam Capital, which does early stage investments in emerging tech, specifically focused on energy and healthcare. We have our first anonymous person, Bodhi, who is an economist and author, and in the words of Anand Ranganathan, a must follow for economy in India, right? So we have like a power-packed episode for you. We're going to be discussing a bunch of topical, global and local issues. So we're going to start with what's been like a hot button topic for a while now, which is the spread of the whole coronavirus, right? We're going to talk about how we prepared, its impact on global markets and so on. Then we're going to step into crude, what's happening in the Middle East and how that impacts India and the rest of the world. And then we're going to talk about something a lot closer home, which is the whole Yes Bank crisis, and make a broader point about bank recapitalization and some finance ministry measures stemming from that, right? Okay. Hi guys, how's everyone doing?
Hi Roshan, Rajiv here.
Hi Roshan, Harsh here. Thank you so much for having me.
Hi Roshan, this is Bodhi.
Hi everyone, welcome to the podcast. So we're going to start with the coronavirus, right? So it's growing at an unprecedented rate. There have been plenty of debate on Twitter. Donald Trump famously says that, hey, it's nothing to worry, it's just a flu. Whereas Nicholas Nassim Taleb, on the other hand, says it's right for us to panic. This is a black swan event. And there are various opinions ranging, from one extreme to the other, right? So Rajiv, you want to talk about, what this means to global markets? We've seen that the Dow Jones also receded yesterday. Do you want to talk about quickly, what this means?
So Roshan, this is one of those things that one of my favorite economists, Frank Knight, he had said, he talked about unknown unknowns. So a global sort of pandemic of this type, the main challenge with this is we don't know when it will stop, and that is what is really scaring investors. That is what is really causing a kind of capital flight from equities across the world. So till there is some kind of a indication or a strong kind of confidence that comes that the world will get it under control and it is not going to keep escalating in the fashion that we've seen it escalate in the last 3 months. Till then, I think there will be a pause, both with listed equities as well as on the private side.
Okay. And Bodhi, do you want to talk about, its impact on India? We see that there are cases have been, the cases have been reported in Bangalore. A couple of cases in Whitefield is what I hear as of this morning, right? So do you want to talk about a few facts and figures related to that?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's very important to set the context on, where does India sit, both from a testing and from a detection perspective on this entire issue. Now, globally, if you look at the count on coronavirus cases, we are somewhere close to about 115,000 cases so far, of which more than 80% of the cases are sitting still in China. But then Korea, Italy, and increasingly Spain and France and Germany as well are reporting a very rapid increase in the number of cases. Now, within this particular spectrum, India, out of the roughly 110 countries which have reported cases on coronavirus, sits within the last 10% of the countries as far as per capita cases are concerned. So we have had roughly about one case for about 32 million people. Most people would say this is because of under testing and under reporting. It is possible that we are not testing enough, but relative to other countries like the US, even some of the advanced economies in Europe, India has had a reasonable amount of cases. Reasonable amount of testing because we have had more than about 4,500 tests. There are close to about 40,000 people who are under observation because of travel, to places which have high rates of infection, or even those who are in close contact with people who have contracted the disease. So I think the monitoring side looks to be reasonably adequate for the number of cases that have been found. Obviously, in case of India, you can never discount, and I think in the last 20 years, India has had a reasonably decent track record, an improving track record of managing public health and public disasters, crises, and that seems to be sort of coming across in the protocols that have been invoked. Now, within this particular context, I don't think India economically will be immune. I mean, we are no economically. We are not an island from that perspective, and clearly you see signs of a pullback in activity levels with several events being cancelled. It'll be interesting whether IPL, which is the marquee event for summer, is kept on track. At the same time, I think the bulk of the precautionary pullback in spending is what will drive a bit of an impact. I think it's a bit too early to sort of say that India will have a quarantine-related slowdown, which seems to be really the shock factor in places like China, and increasingly it will be in Italy.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I completely agree with your point in terms of India being more robust and anti-fragile to a degree, right? This is something that Balaji Srinivasan, who's one of the better-known investors and entrepreneurs in the valley, has also confirmed, saying that hey, India has been handling this way better than some of the more developed economies like the US or even parts of Europe, right? So Harsh, you want to talk about specifically how we're prepared in case of an escalation? I mean, so if this thing, let's say, if there are more cases being reported, and the spread of the virus actually goes down the path of doom, right? So how are we prepared for it in India from an infrastructure perspective?
Hi, Roshan. I would first of all definitely echo Rajiv and Bodhi in terms of this is an unknown, and we've done so far fairly decently on the prevention side. As Bodhi rightly said, in fact, as of yesterday, we've done more than 500,000 tests at the various airports and seaports of the country. But let us say, the cases do somehow exponentially increase from around the 40 odd cases that we have right now, out of which 14 or 15 are Italian tourists. And it suddenly goes into 3 digits and then 4 digits like it's happened in Italy or Iran. Then how well are we prepared for it? I think the short answer would be that's where, us being a poorer country and having less state capacity would start showing. So our best bet remains very much on the prevention side. India does have about one doctor for every 920 Indian citizens, but that also includes non-allopathic doctors, so like Unani, Ayurveda, so on and so forth. The CAPF and various other, extra army police forces have been asked to prepare quarantine and, kind of quasi-medical centers for 5,500 people. Just yesterday there was a headline about that. But if it really becomes as widespread as it is in some other countries, I'm not very optimistic about our state capacity as of now. Having said that, while this virus is very new and we don't have any peer-reviewed papers on how this spreads, and we should never assume anything, it does seem that it disproportionately targets older people with low immunity, especially with hypertension, high blood pressure. It also seems to be less prevalent or less easily spread in warmer temperatures, although again that is not proven yet, and I'm no public health expert. However, both the factors, even if true or partially true, go in India's favor. India has a young demographic. We are a warmer country, and we are right now entering April in a few weeks. the beginning of summer. So in that sense, we might just get a bit lucky. But if this actually goes beyond prevention, then the short answer to your question is not very optimistic, I'm afraid.
No, so I would add to Harsh's point on state capacity. So in general, because of the lack of hospitals and lack of doctors in India, we find that the existing infrastructure is always stretched, and the kind of stresses that our medical staff is used to working in is not something that those in Western countries are accustomed to. So, while they are being overwhelmed by the numbers coming into hospitals and so on, I think if you look at the median doctor in a small town or somewhere in India, they are anyway sort of stretched to the limit. So, at least in terms of capacity to respond, our doctors are probably better placed than, let's say, some doctor in Europe.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, right? So, I mean, with another thing that kind of is slowing demand in general is the whole crisis in the Middle East, right? Which is King Salman has passed away, and his son MDS is consolidating power there, and there is talks of OPEC slashing crude prices as well. So, Bodhi, do you want to extend that point on how that is impacting global economies as well?
Yeah, sure. So I don't know whether King Salman has really passed away or not, but I think what we are seeing right now is probably a reflection of just the fact that a lot of the Middle Eastern countries and OPEC in general, they have gone through a lot of turmoil in the last decade or so, right? I mean, right from the time we had Arab Spring, which basically catalyzed into a popular youth movement, which resulted in a very large-scale expansion in the budgets of several Middle Eastern countries, and so the price of oil and the volume of oil that's required to be sold in order to keep those budgets up and running did go up. And the fact that both the Russians and the Saudis couldn't agree on production cuts, and Saudi, I think, is basically trying to ensure that its market share by revenue does not get impacted. Now, obviously, there's a demand element to it, and we have seen a significant pullback on the demand side as far as oil is concerned. Effectively, to put some numbers in context, we have had close to about 80% cancellation in flight schedules around China, which is the second biggest aviation market in the world. Similarly, passenger traffic levels in China are down close to about 40 to 60%, depending on which part of the country you look at. Even in rest of Asia, it is probably down about 25%. In aviation traffic, we'll also probably be seeing similar numbers in terms of passenger car traffic. And so my point is that this risk aversion and this change in consumer behavior is really pulling back demand for crude oil, and the demand outlook is going to become even more complicated as we enter the summer months, which is typically when the peak demand for oil and for energy products sort of kicks in. And you don't have any resolution, or we are sort of entering the biggest stress period for energy, and so in such a situation, it's hard to see how oil is going to globally improve. Certainly, it's going to be a bit of a tailwind for India, but I would say at best a mitigating factor. Oil prices can help in improving corporate profitability or reducing costs. It's not going to make it's not going to completely overturn the global economic slowdown that India will be staring at in the next couple of months or so. So yeah, back to you, Roshan.
Okay, so we're not sure of two things: whether King Salman is dead, and about, what's going to happen to oil prices. So Rajiv, we want to talk about how this impacts the US economy. We're seeing some movement there as well, and what this means for shale prices and so on, and Donald Trump's presidency.
So the pandemic-like situation is certainly affecting demand. with all kinds of sort of events being cancelled, travel being postponed, generally consumption being maybe major consumption items would be put off in the face of such a uncertainty. So that combined with the plummeting of oil prices because of Saudi Arabia's action, both things I think on the negative side for the US, because most people don't realize that the US in recent recent months, especially over the last like 18 months or so, has become a very important oil exporter, and the shale industry there has enabled that. So the low oil prices will definitely hurt the oil producing states in the US, particularly in the Texas and southwestern region there. So it really is one of those things. I think it's very hard to say how it will impact, for example, the political cycle. If it affects the economy, will this affect Trump's re-election odds? Could it open the door again for Bernie Sanders over Joe Biden? Because even that is not settled. The Democratic primary is not settled yet. So it really is a very difficult thing to say in one way or the other. But I do think that from India's perspective, India as a large purchaser of or rather importer of oil, it has like plenty of options, and the way India has been tying foreign policy with how it purchases oil and who sort of sells oil to India, I think in that respect it has a pretty good hand at the moment because there's excess supply and India is a large buyer.
Yeah, interesting. So I want to veer this conversation a little towards the politics as well, right? So with MBS now clearly trying to consolidate power, what does this mean to India? I know Prime Minister Modi has met him a couple of times last year, and they have discussed some strategic investments and so on. Harsh, you want to talk about what this means to India?
Yes, absolutely. So basically, what India has been doing in the last, ever since Narendra Modi became Prime Minister in 2014, is very gradually reorienting itself in foreign policy towards the US. And I would say as of 2020, we are now a de facto, if not a de jure American ally. We're not a de jure American ally because, our just our size and pride and ego would not allow us to do that, which is fine, which is perhaps how it should be. Because, as you've seen some remarks from the US as well, so we don't want to go all that distance. But since we are part of a de facto US alliance network, what does that mean? It means that, we've chosen to be on the Sunni Arab GCC Saudi Arabia side in Middle East, and we finally in the process of severing a link to some extent with Iran, which also explains the very, very harsh commentary that we are seeing from the Iranian leadership on Kashmir or Delhi riots or what have you. So we have chosen to be, as in the Middle East, the two key US allies are the GCC, which is the Gulf countries, that's Saudi Arabia and UAE primarily, and Israel. So we've gotten closer to both. We've tried to buy more arms from the US, less from Russia. We're trying to indigenously develop more arms. We've not joined the China Free Trade Agreement, led free trade agreement called RCEP. We've not joined the Belt and Road Initiative. So this has to be seen as part of a broader reorientation of Indian foreign policy, and which therefore means India and the Saudis have a better relationship. You would recall, I think 1 or 2 years ago, a Dubai princess was trying to run away. And while India has not officially confirmed this 33-year-old princess was basically nabbed off a ship, a US flagged ship off 50 kilometers off Goa, and basically returned to the Arabs. That was seen as a sign of cooperation and trust building, and obviously it's not been officially confirmed because of obvious human right and other implications. But the Saudis, you must have noticed, were the only large Islamic country bloc that actually said that either 370 is an internal matter or it's actually something done for internal security of India. They've not said anything on the Delhi riots and CA and so on and so forth. So I think the contours are very clear of what kind of development is happening between India and the Saudis. Within the Saudi kingdom, because MBS, the real power, even though he's crown prince technically, is basically he's understood the tea leaves very clearly. He's saying the age of oil is about to pass in a few years. How do I develop a new economy? I'll have to rely on tourism. I'll have to rely on some immigration, which will have to in turn mean some kind of cultural opening, more rights for women, and so on and so forth. And while he does that, and he has to do it at a certain pace, he cannot go too slow. He therefore needs to make sure that there is no attempt to overthrow him while he's doing this. So whether there was an actual coup attempt by his father's brother and nephew or not, or whether the Crown Prince MBS basically just acted preemptively, made up a coup story and put them behind bars and possibly they'll be executed, we don't know. But what this shows is that he's very clear about consolidating power while he reorients the country domestically. And finally, on the crude price, what triggered this discussion, we have to understand that, no matter what price the Saudis pay, the Russians pay, or the American shale industry pays, Iranians are definitely in no position to suffer a sustained loss in exports, crude exports, because ultimately the government. So one of the reasons the Saudis and Russians fell apart was Russians are on the other side in Syria, right? The Alawite leadership of Syria is basically Shia. They're basically Shia, and the Saudis are trying to knock out that the Russian support for these regimes. I think all of them, both Saudis and Russia, have more than $500 billion in forex reserves. Russia even has a floating currency, so they'll both survive. But I think they're both kind of more than the U.S. shale industry. The real target might be Iran and its proxies.
So I'll just add a couple of points to what Harsh has said. I think for India, obviously, as Harsh rightly has pointed out, there's been a bit of recalibration in the foreign policy angle, and it is important, I think, from India's perspective that regimes in places like Saudi and even the UAE. For that matter, continue to remain strong despite the fact that oil prices have gone down, and our relations remain quite tight with them, simply because of the angle of how many Indians work in the Gulf countries, and the impact it has on our consumption, particularly in several key states like Kerala, Punjab. Increasingly even in the Gangetic Plain states like Bihar, Jharkhand, and Odisha. So that's something that India should always sort of keep at the back of their mind, that even though oil prices are low, there can be incremental risks that will come from very low oil prices as well, and we need to have some mitigation strategies in place in order to tackle them.
No, and just to add to what Bodhi and Harsh mentioned on oil, so I think it will be very interesting to see how India responds in this kind of an environment to Iran, because Iran obviously recently went out of its way to comment on India's internal issues, and Malaysia had done that some months ago, and one of the extraordinary actions which India took, which extraordinary because we had never done such a thing before, was we blocked palm oil exports that Malaysia makes to India. So India is a large buyer of palm oil. Malaysia was one of the largest exporters to India of palm oil. And after Malaysia said what it said, India decided to sort of punish it in a way, or take some retributive action for making a public statement of that type. So Iran too has gone that way. And it will be interesting to see what the Indian government does in the current environment, where obviously, as Harsh said, we are de facto US allies at this point, a very strong relationship with the Saudis. And when there is excess supply of oil, whom does India prioritize for its purchases?
So I'll just quickly comment. So, just to lay out what is happening in the oil market, is about 100 million barrels of consumption globally, and therefore production as well, and of crude and crude equivalent per day. And the US is raced ahead to be the number one supplier. It's around 18 million right now if you include oil and oil equivalent gas. And actually OPEC itself has come down to around 27-28%. So OPEC is basically Saudi Arabia, the rest of the Gulf countries, Iran, a few African states, and so on and so forth. And the negotiations that were happening in Vienna were OPEC plus, which is basically effectively Saudi, Russia, and a few other small countries. So they together, even OPEC plus is around 40% of the supply. So what the US shale has done is, even if, despite all these geopolitical factors and this and that scheming, etc., the Saudis and the Russians come together, even then shale has put a ceiling on the price of crude for effectively the foreseeable future. Because it just produces now 18%. The US overall produces 18% of all oil and oil equivalent supply in the world. So that is basically what has changed the dynamics of the oil market in 2016, late 2015 and early 2016. Before that, in 2014 as well, the Saudis had tried to, just basically flood the market and see if shale would be able to withstand it or not. And the end result was that shale actually ended up being more efficient in the US, because unlike these NOCs, these national oil companies, shale is operated by small private operators, and they have a very fast learning curve, what is known in business as an experience curve. So I just want to say that there is a lot of geopolitical maneuvering here for sure, but there is a key technological ceiling on the price of crude as well. It's not as low as it is right now, but triple-digit crude is, unless there is a massive world war or something of the sorts, is basically out of question for the foreseeable future.
Okay, just one last question on that. So, do you see the government passing on the benefits of lower crude prices to end consumers in India? Harsh, you can take that.
Yes. Well, I don't think this time the government will try to mop up too much taxes like they did in late 2014, 15, 16. Because I think the economy is very, very fragile right now for obvious reasons, as we've discussed. And I think the government may increase 1 or 2 rupees of excise or VAT here and there. But I think this time they'll let most of it pass, because the automobile industry is down. The overall commercial vehicles industry is down. So it would also be an indirect automatic stabilizer, as is known in macro jargon. It's a good fiscal deficit expansion excuse. So I don't think this time the government will take away all the benefits. This time a substantial amount of it will pass, at least for the next few months, for sure.
Okay, so speaking of fragile economy and things to that effect, let's move on to what's happening in India with the whole Yes Bank crisis. Yes Bank started in 2004, grew aggressively, started by Ashok Kapoor with a U and Rana Kapoor with a double O. And then collapsing under the weight of bad decisions, bad management, and now the government stepping in, right? So Bodhi, what do you think sums up the whole Yes Bank fiasco for you?
Well, I think the situation is still somewhat fluid, although with SBI sort of stepping in, I think the end game is coming closer and closer. I think the broad lessons that we would draw, and this is something that's probably has been happening for the last 5 years or so, is that we probably need to increase RBI's surveillance capacity, and there needs to be a lot more work done on regulatory enforcement. So if you sort of there are enough threads now on Twitter which are kind of going around explaining what was going on. I mean, if this knowledge was so prevalent, it's shocking that that we have had the kind of delay in taking over Yes Bank as we have had. It also probably tells you about the government and how they have sort of chosen not to go down the easy path of bailing out everyone, right? I mean, so people who have been sort of questioning or asking about a TARP-like situation effectively were okay with creating a lot of bad apples to be put in the basket as well again. And so I think if given that we have already taken the decision to take over Yes Bank, and it sort of it will lead to an improvement in the health of the overall balance sheet of the financial system. I think from my perspective, looking ahead, the biggest question will be, how do you prevent a similar situation, say 5 or 10 or 20 years down the line? And my sense on this is that RBI, while they have not been great at predicting crises or sort of being preemptive in their regulatory framework, they are very good as far as adaptive memory is concerned. And now that they've gone through this kind of a situation, probability of a similar situation happening, say 15-20 years down the line is low. So they will learn from it. It hasn't made them look good, but then ultimately, it was a necessary decision, probably a very delayed decision. I think there are several important market commentators, especially Neelkant Mishra, had been talking about the need for the government to step in. Now that we have chosen to step in, I think the resolution will come much quicker than what most people are anticipating it to come. Yeah.
Interesting. So, Harsh, you want to step in and make a point on the broader impact of this, and your thoughts on bank recapitalization, which is again something that's being talked about.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, first thing first, I'd like to again echo Bothi here. The RBI, I'm sure while the steps from now here forward would be much better, does not come across looking quite well in this case. We have to remember that Mr. Das, who was the governor of RBI for basically just the last 1 year or so. Before that, there was Raghuram Rajan or Urjit Patel. And surprisingly, in popular commentary as well as in the pink papers, they've gotten away scot-free. Because there's some tweets going around saying, well, the overall loan book of Yes Bank went up 4 times, even during Narendra Modi's tenure. And while that might be true, the first responsibility there is that of the RBI governor. So with such kind of brazen lending as it is now coming out, what was the RBI doing? So that's point one. So it's not really so much about public banks or private banks in this particular context as it is about just good old regulation and supervision. Now, so which brings us to what happens. In this case, the bank literally had to be taken over. In many public sector banks, we basically just evergreen them by doing. The government periodically puts in money. A couple of years ago, we had announced $32 billion. Then we had some NBFC crisis, and every budget you're putting in a few $1 billion of basically issuing new equity of public sector banks, and then the government buying them, and which, far from disinvesting, keeps on raising the government equity stake in the various banks. And the reason why that happens is, one of the reforms, small reforms, less remarkable reforms, Nirmala Sitharaman announced last year was having market salaries for the chief risk officer of public sector banks, market-linked salaries. So they still don't have market-linked salaries though for the CEO of the bank, for other top officials of the bank. This is the kind of micromanagement that is happening. I mean, there were a lot of talks about a bank board in the middle between the finance ministry and the public sector banks. Something like a Temasek or a GIC, a quasi-sovereign domestically focused wealth fund, which would allow some kind of hands-on operation. But then the issue is, if you need to bail out companies like Yes Bank or other banks, you can't really be completely hands-off as well, right? So the broader point that we are seeing is, once we get rid of this crisis, once we're out of the cyclical bottom, I think the contours of the Indian financial system are becoming clear. We are going from a bank-led model to a very Anglo-American capital markets model, which is arm's-length financial intermediation. We're going towards a bond-led. Already the Indian equity market for our per capita income is extremely sophisticated in terms of secondary market, futures and options, so on and so forth. And we are now trying to replicate that in the corporate bond market, as well as making the government bond market more liquid. So what happens because no matter unless the banking system is extremely well capitalized, these Minsky moments, these moments of instability, even when they're well capitalized, at some moment are inevitable. So we need to have a system where we have bond-led funding for corporates also available, which they're anyways getting from foreign ECBs right now. We need to have our credit rating agencies more credible. The entire tax incentives around it need to be clear. And I think we are very much in the early stages of that. Already the incremental bank financing for the last few years compared to bond financing has been relatively low compared to the previous few years. And even the bank financing in the last couple of years, a lot of it is actually buying NBFC books, which means that when the NBFC crisis happened, banks just ended up buying their books, and actually fresh new loans have not been that high. So I don't think the banking crisis is completely behind us. Maybe in terms of NPA as a percentage of book, it is behind us, but it's not fully behind us. But once it's all settled, we'll have to get to a model in which bank recapitalization is not a big part of it to begin with.
Okay, that's a fair point. So
Roshan, can I make a point very quickly on on the banking system? So I do think that consolidation of PSU banks, which will happen effective April 1st, where we'll have a smaller base of PSU banks, where the cleanup is sort of seems to be getting toward the end now. The good thing now is that a lot of the bad stuff in the system seems to have been ejected. But I think the next step has to be government getting out of the business of banking. So that would mean some of the consolidated PSU banks, maybe there needs to be further consolidation or even outright sale of these government-owned banks. Because I don't think you can completely eliminate the risk of mislending and remove government from being on the hook for bad loans until you remove government from the business of banking itself.
Yeah, that's true. So shall we move on to some questions from Twitter, guys?
Sure.
Okay. So at someone's mad at me. Wow, brilliant Twitter handle. Sorry. Says, is it a good time to invest in stock market? So Harsh, you want to take that? Also, you might want to put out a disclaimer.
I don't know. If he knows, can he please tell me? I have no idea.
Okay. At Buckyball says, do you see crude trend sustaining? An exact time prediction is welcome. Who wants to take this? Both of you want to take this?
Yeah, sure. So I think, the trend is likely to sustain at least for the next 3 to 6 months. It's unlikely we're going to see a major increase in prices. I think the one scenario that I keep worrying about is the virus becoming quite prevalent in the Middle East, and you have supply disruptions in oil production on the back of it. But that itself is quite a stretch scenario. I don't have a sense on what timing should it be.
Okay, Buckyball also has this other question, which is, how is government going to finance its ambitious infrastructure plan? How much of it do you see actually happening out of the big budget promised? Who wants to take this?
I can take a stab at that. So yeah, I think the government announced 102 lakh crores of investing on the next 5 years. It's a government viability funding along with all the other private sector contributions. So that's about 1.4 trillion, I think, dollars over the next 5 years. And obviously all of that is not coming directly from budgetary resources. That's simply, the math doesn't add up, far from it. So what the government has done in the last 5-6 years is it has laid a very good kind of legal, institutional, economic system for capital recycling in infrastructure projects. So there are 4-5 steps I can quickly go through that. So one thing, they did a few TOTs, the classic auctioning of highways directly to domestic or foreign institutional investors, toll, operate, transfer. Then we have these listed and unlisted investment trusts for real estate and infrastructure, where you have certain tax benefits if you pass through 90% of the cash flow which you're supposed to, the profits. So that has allowed, for example, it's done very well in the beginning with real estate investment trusts. So for example, Embassy REIT has done very well. Even the India Grid Trust or the Power Lines Infrastructure Trust has done very well. The roads one, not so much so far. Although there's a lot of investment coming in the unlisted InvIT space for road projects. Then in this budget, we've announced time-bound 4 or 5 years, completely tax-free investments for the sovereign wealth funds and certain other foreign investors, if they remain invested in Indian infrastructure assets, and they'll only go and buy existing assets. There won't be any greenfield assets as such in that. So what the government is basically signaling to its own Ministry of Roads, NHAI, as well as the domestic EPC ecosystem, the BOT ecosystem, the HAM ecosystem, the hybrid annuity model, that make as much roads as you possibly can. We'll make sure that you have an exit. We'll make sure that you can monetize it, lower your debt, and then go on and bid for the next highway or the best next rail project or the irrigation project or a power project. So I think the recapitalization part was missing. See, historically in places like China or Japan or Germany, a lot of these infrastructure have been built through state-controlled or state-influenced bank lending. We are clearly exiting that model. That was part of the reason for the NPAs in the last infra binge from 2003 to 2008. We all, some other countries like Germany have DFIs or development financial institutions. We don't have any DFIs. In fact, our DFIs in 1990s ended up becoming retail and corporate banks. So the only place left is again the capital markets, foreign funding, which is what I hinted at earlier as well. What I think the government can do here is expand this investor base to domestic investors as well. For example, these tax incentives for infrastructure investment, because beyond a point, a lot of any strong FII flows in a net basis necessarily means a current account deficit. It's an accounting identity. And given the macro situation globally, we can't rely on consistent FII flows, even quasi-debt flows, quasi-equity flows for the next 4-5 years. So, but the basic steps for this to be done has already been laid in the first term. I'll leave it.
So just to come in on that point, around what Harsh said, I think one idea which was there not in this budget but in the previous budget, which the government should start seriously considering again, is the idea of floating a sovereign bond. If you compare where, in 2009 when we had the global financial crisis and where China's economy was at, and the amount of stimulus that China had sort of undertaken, which had supported global demand or helped revive it. I think India, maybe not to the same extent, but India can play a part in reviving global demand, especially in the context of very, very cheap financing rates available in foreign currency terms, whether you look at dollars, yen or euro. And I think most countries will actually welcome it because they will see it as a global stimulus, right? So if India does want a seat at the high table, they would need to sort of think a bit bigger and think a bit bolder. And economic policy in this kind of a situation, as and when the virus sort of starts getting contained, focus will very quickly shift to economic. How quickly does the economy rebound? And India, being the third largest economy on a PPP basis, has a huge role to play in that. And one way to finance it will be to revive the idea of issuing sovereign bonds.
I just want to say I fully agree with Bodhi there. Just to add to his point, I think countries like Greece and Italy, I just saw Italy's 10Y borrowing rate yesterday was 1%, right? And India is at 6%. So just to break it down for our listeners, if the two investors, one is lending to Italy for 10 years at 1%, and India 10 years at 6%, you have to assume the euro appreciates 5% every year for the next 10 years against the rupee for that to be somehow equivalent trades. And that's obviously not the case. So, and unlike other emerging markets like Brazil or Mexico or Russia, India's got really no, or Argentina, India's got no bankruptcy history or somehow reneging on its sovereign debt. So where is the communication missing? Where are we not being able to get part of this lower rates that we seemingly deserve? And one way to square the circle is what Bodhi said, and I've written about it, and he's written about it, is to make sure that we have what's the outgoing SEBI chief, Mr. Tyagi, has said. We don't have a bond yield curve for the corporates, right? Most issuances are at 3 to 5 years or 10 years at most, and so we don't have a consistent curve even for the government, liquid curve for the government, where they can, okay, this is a 1 year rate, this is a 3 year rate, this is a 5 year rate, this is a 10 year, 20, 30 years. So in India, people just follow 10 year short term, everything else is illiquid. So how can corporates, for example, say, okay, this is the government rate at this tenure, and we'll have so much basis points added for risk premium. So we need to make sure that, right now we can basically borrow for free. especially in euros, I would say. And the Chinese are doing it, and other countries are doing it. We can limit it to a certain number of $1 billion per year. We can keep it very small, but we need to do it.
I think the larger point is, we grossly undersell ourselves. I think that's something that we can all agree. So, okay, moving on to the next question. At Hirva Trivedi says, what will happen to crude rates? I think we covered that. So we'll move on to the...
No, so actually, Roshan, can I make just one point on crude prices?
Sure.
So many countries which have national budgets are dependent on getting a certain amount of oil revenue. So when the oil price collapses, these countries will be forced to sort of pump more to make up their budget numbers, But then that has the perverse effect of probably pushing prices even lower. So we still don't know yet whether that cycle has run out. So while $30, $32, $35 right now seems low, it could go much lower.
Okay, interesting. Moving on to the next point, at Shresht Kapoor says, what should be the future course for the finance minister related to policy measures? Actually, this is a damn good note to end on. So let's go around the table and maybe talk about one policy measure, one near-term policy measure that the government must implement in order for us to benefit immensely, right? So we'll start with Harsh. What is the one thing that the government must do in the next 3 to 6 months?
Sure. So since you've restricted it to 3 to 6 months, I'll not mention the making our public sector more efficient, making our bureaucracy more efficient, administrative reforms and judicial reforms, because that cannot be done in 3 to 6 months with this crisis mode. What can be done in 3 to 6 months over and above what Modi and I mentioned right now is, and related idea to that, is to speedily, with a lot of focus, push Indian sovereign bonds into global bond indices. And that's already being done, by the way. It's already being done. And the question is whether it will be finished in 6 months or not. The government, for this reason, announced that certain securities, there are certain strips of government debt that will be issued, will be open to all foreigners, which is one of the requirements of being able to invest in and invest out, for that kind of debt to be included into global bond indices. However, the issue is, the weight you get into that index is contingent upon the number and the value of such debt in which you can enter and exit. So at some point we'll have to take a bolder decision and allow more or less unrestricted entry and exit from our government sovereign debt. We'll have to trust our forex reserves. Touching $500 billion is enough of a safety wall. We'll have to understand that if there is a sudden exodus, then our central bank can very much do open market operations and various kind of twists and turns and LTROs to make the market stable. Because these government bonds that are all rupee denominated, right? The dollar and euro one was supposed to be a very small idea, anyways, more as a transition idea. This is the big fish that we are after, because you see, the Indian equities are already in global equity indices, but Indian bond markets are not. So that is one way of getting a stable, secure supply of funding, which can increase. Which can reduce interest rates and as well as risk premium and increase liquidity in the Indian market at the right places at the right time. So I think making sure that this is not some kind of technocratic project handled by only 3 or 4 key guys, but gets priority from the PMO and the finance minister herself, I think is something that I would really push for in the next 3 to 6 months, over and above any virus things, which is anyways more for health ministry concern.
Okay. Rajiv, you want to go next?
No, so, not something specific that I would like to say for 3 to 6 months, but I will say in a slightly more general sense that I think directionally the government is doing many excellent things, but they're not happening fast enough. Whether it is the sale of certain PSUs, other types of reform measures on taxes and other things, things don't seem to be going fast enough. And many issues seem to fester. So I wonder why that is happening, and I wish things would just be executed in a more timely fashion and in a more predictable fashion.
Okay. Yeah, again, something that all of us can agree on, I think. Bodhi, you want to round this up? What is your wish list from the government? I know that's a long list, but let's stick to one for now.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the one immediate wish list is let the oil price decline pass through to consumers and to companies. I think this is not the time to try and tax and spend. I think the government should spend as much as they can in order to mitigate the downside risks coming from global factors. But then don't try to do it by increasing taxes and then spending. It sort of becomes a moot point.
Okay, that's kind of a cheery note to end the podcast on. Guys, this was fantastic. I mean, I think we covered a range of issues. I wish we could have delved deeper into some of these. Maybe we'll unpack some of them in the episodes to come. But thank you so much for your insights. It was really useful, at least from my perspective, right? Anyone has any last comments?
I just hope you come up with better jokes next time, Roshan.
Better jokes for Yes Mag. Yeah, sure. Next time I'm going to prep properly, and I'm going to cue laughter also. We're going to follow that for sure. So thanks so much for tuning in. This was the 4th episode of the Bharatvaarta podcast. We covered a bunch of issues around coronavirus and OPEC impact on global markets, impact here in India, what the government can do, and the Yes Bank crisis, and some broader points related to fiscal policy. So thanks so much for tuning in. Hope to catch you soon. The podcast will soon be out on Spotify, Anchor.fm, Pocket Casts, and a bunch of other places. Do engage with our Twitter handle, that is @Bharatvaarta. And see you soon. Bye-bye.